We are beginning our session, which is the second part of our economic session actually. We are already far behind our schedule, that's why I will have to ask kindly our speakers also to a little bit shorten their presentations, and we can continue because we will be having dinner as well, and during the dinner we can continue with our presentations. I have quite distinguished speakers here who are either my close friends or my teachers or whom I used to work to cooperate since a long time. And Dr. Raja Al-Marzougi, Dr. Mete Durdar, Dr. Peter Havlik, and Dr. Riham Rizk. I would like to begin start our session with Dr. Raja Al-Marzougi, who is his actually comprehensive information about him you can find in biodata, which is in front of you on your tables. He is head of IMF mission in Azerbaijan, and he will be speaking about Arab countries in transition, challenges and potentials. Please, Doctor.
Thanks. It's really difficult, end of the day, to present such kind of a dry subject. As they called us an economist, our subject is a little bit dry. Where I was hoping that our subject was a little bit early in the morning and the political issue, the politics a little bit late, where a lot of debate can take place and people will find it easier to follow. But anyhow, I'm now here and also pushed by the dinner which has been promised by organizer. I don't want to keep you for a longer time here, so we'll try to master this one, yeah. Before we start, as you can notice, this is a historical background about the growth per capita income in the region, which is really one of the lowest per capita income in the world. And you can notice how it was before, and it's really slowing, and the margin between the growth of emerging market is wider as its emerging market getting higher growth, and our region is almost left behind. Where in reality it's growing below its capacity. The capacity of the region is much better than this growth. This can be growing in a higher percentage. This is also when we compare it with the rest of the world. You can notice per capita income in the Middle East and the rest of the world, and is widening the percentage between them as our per capita income in the regions left behind. And mostly the growth in the region is linked to oil. Yes, it's only a few countries in the region which export oil, but the whole region is linked directly and indirectly to oil, where any growth takes place in oil countries is reflected in the rest of the region. And lately, after this Arab Spring happens, we add also another important factor. It's instability become really important as one of the important factors determine the growth of the region. Why our region left behind per capita growth? What's happened? Is it because we could not do it, or there is a structural problem? There is, from the literature, which try to determine how many factors and which factors that affecting the growth. They list a few of them. The first one, domestic political tensions. I think I have a difficulty with this one here, so please bear with me. Okay. And now there is a few lists here that could not appear. I don't know what happens in the slide, but there is another issue. So first one, domestic political tension. The second one, security. When we say security, most of the political system in the region, they're maximizing their security of the party or the people in the power more than maximizing the welfare of the economy. As an economist, usually we consider the government, its main role is to maximizing the welfare of people more than to maximizing the welfare of people in power only. The third issue, corruption. It's one of the important issues that affecting the growth. The fourth one, the public sector. Public sector dominated the economy in the region, which is crowding out private sector. Another reason, weakening of educational system. And this has a big potential, big negative impact on the growth. Other reason, inadequate infrastructure and institution setup in the region. Custom considered as one of the big problem also in the region. All these issues that affecting per capita growth led to, first of all, capital migration from the region, discouraging investment, and most of the investment in the region, as they get worried about what's going on in the region at the time and also after, their focus in the short term more than long-term investment. This is the three important factors that consider is making a limitation in the growth. The first one is lack of adequate infrastructures, which is we just three issues under this one: the transportation, logistics, and electricity. The second one, inadequate services, which is either inefficient from the government side or also inappropriate quality from the public sector. The third one, this match between labor and also education, which is affecting the demand and the supply and demand of labor. Recently, after Arab Spring, all this issue led to this pressure happens, and after Arab Spring, we have three issues now affecting the macroeconomics picture. The first one is the externally, which is the global environment. Global economy is not growing in a healthy way that can contribute to the region, so this is an important factor. Second, spillover from the region, and you can notice our region is really linked. Any issue in any one of these countries spill to the rest of our other countries in the region, which has a big effect. And now Syria has a big impact on the region, as well as the other country is still not stable. The third issue, the social pressure from inside and unstable, that put higher pressure on the government to think now short term more than long term. All these issues led to declining consumer confidence. Also, productions, industrial productions, it's almost stagnated, so it's not growing in a healthy way. I think many speakers before me, they talked about the FDI, foreign direct investment, how it's declining in the regions. So I will not go through all these numbers to save the time. With all this impact, we expect that the growth in 2013 for the region is around 2.9. In 2014, will not pass 3.2, which is really not enough to create jobs and solve unemployment. And you can notice unemployment increased after Arab Spring more than declining. And with this macro picture is in a negative way, not promising, we expect that it's may a little bit longer than what was expected before. and has big impact on unemployment and affecting that. And most of the unemployment also take place on young generation, where in some countries it's reached around 40 or 35% of the young generations without job. Downsides coming also from Syrian crisis that spill over either directly to country around where refugees been in Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey, and this has put more pressure in government of these countries to try to provide services. And some of this country, for example, refugees become around 18% of the whole population, which a big demand, and has a big effect also on tourists coming to these countries, as been previous speakers was talking about this issue. I think the most important issue for this country to help private sector to lead the growth, not public sector to lead the growth. Public sector important, really important for the growth to put in place the right regulation, the right policies, the educations, but not to solve all the problem in the economy and to crowd out the private sector, but providing the right business environment. And also, if the private sector felt the government and the macroeconomics policy will not lead to more crises in the future, especially when it comes to more debt and deficit in the government budget, then they will be encouraged with the right policies and right environment and more security to come in and invest in the region. And there is a big potential in the region when it's come to its location, its optimum location between east and west. And it can be used at these locations. I have met several investors where they thinking to jump in the region after Arab Spring because they felt this will reduce some of the cost when they want to export to Europe or if they want to import something from east. But with what's going on in the region now, most of the investors whom I met in several conferences become more pessimistic more than optimistic, while first time when it's happened the Arab Spring, I heard a lot of them were a little bit optimistic, and some of them even jumped in and put some money, and they started to lose this money. Also, the populations where it's most the growth of population is high. Second, also most of them in the young generation, where the labor force is huge. This is will provide the private sector with the right people to work and also to reduce the cost, because with the high unemployment, this is another opportunity for investors to come and utilize this labor force. It's not been utilized in these countries. But unfortunately, the reality now, when we saw how the unemployment increased, also the efficiency of public investment is declining, all this contribute negatively to the macroeconomics picture in the region. And importantly for the region and for government to think about policies more in an inclusive way. So inclusive growth, this reform have to be in many dimensions. Either in educations, in public service, in many of these reforms. I don't want to go through with them to save your time, but this is important to have inclusive growth more than growth in one dimension, which will not have the whole society covered. This is a priority which we think is really important for the region to cover and to be taken into consideration. One important issue is the public spending and maintaining the public spending and more in net saving more than just subsidies and everything. So rationalize the subsidies and should be targeted to the right segment of the society, encourage and provide the private sector with the right business environment that encourage the private sector to lead the growth more than the government spending led the growth. This is without a clear vision from government and right policy, and such kind of vision should be also announced and make it clear for investors to encourage them about the government future vision. And also the government should stick to this vision to give a confidence to private sector they mean it when they put this plan. A need from external might be important also, either from country around or from the global community to help the growth in this region, either through technical assistance, through training, investment, loans. All this is maybe needed in the short term to push the growth in this region, but without right policies from these countries, Arab country in transmission, without right policies, then any support or help will be only short term and will gone, will not be last for longer time in these countries, and they will not benefit from it. But with the right policy, with the right vision, this is will utilize all this support coming from outside to have more long-term impact on the growth more than short-term. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Marzougi, for very comprehensive information about macroeconomic factors to do with Arab countries. And quickly to proceed to Dr. Mete Durda, who also used to be attached used to work for IMF as well, and was in 90s was head of delegation for IMF that was existing in Azerbaijan. Please, Mete Bey. Pleasure.
Well, let me first thank the chairman and to the some organization which made this event possible, and also invited me to come back to Baku, where I have been working on and off since 1993. Well, my talk today is on the economic implications of the Arab Spring or Arab awakening and the resulting transition in Arab countries. And I arranged my talk in two parts. One, to look at the impact of these political and social turmoil on the key macroeconomic variables in the North Africa and Middle East in general, and in some specific countries. And the second part, I wanted to focus on some key issues, three key issues, which I feel encompass the many other important policy and structural issues. But the presentations done earlier this afternoon and today by the previous speaker all have covered already what I could have said in the first part of my talk, and therefore I don't want to repeat it. In any case, the text of my statement will be available to you all later on. Therefore, and also to serve the time saving, I am skipping the first part of my talk about the impact of the Arab Spring events on key macroeconomic variables, and I will turn to the second part which will focus on the, as I said, some key issues. Those issues have also been raised by the earlier speakers, but I will try to, the same issue I'll try to emphasize in a probably from a different angle, from a different approach. Have I left my card? Here. As experienced by all countries that had gone through a period of political instability, the countries that have been going through since 2011 Arab Spring protests, social unrest, and aftermath have inflicted large...
Sorry, Dr. Durda, can we use microphone, please? Yeah, thanks very much.
Okay. Have inflicted large output losses and increased unemployment. Macroeconomic balances have come under strain as fiscal deficits widened from already high levels. External current account deficits have deteriorated and international reserves have declined, which have all been explained in full detail by earlier speakers. The start of recovery process will have to wait until political instability and social unrest subside and new governments begin responding to Arab Spring demands. The recovery was often slow and took about 5 years in the past cases of political instability in transition countries. In the case of Arab Spring economies, the recovery may take even longer because of weak external demand, particularly from European countries, high food and fuel prices, and weak initial fiscal positions. The sizable financial support coming from the international community and from the Gulf countries will help shorten the economic recovery process and hence quicken restoring political stability. The Arab Spring and accompanying political and social instability will gradually, hopefully, move towards stability conditions and with the help of course, international communities' financial help. These macroeconomic balances or imbalances could gradually be removed and the affected countries could recover their pre-disturbances levels and patterns of economic growth. This will not, however, be a sustainable recovery, as it will be missing the real grievances of the masses underlying the Arab Spring protests. The deep structural problems that predate the Arab Spring, namely high youth unemployment and large pockets of poverty among disadvantaged groups of population, will not be mitigated by recovering the macroeconomic balances and by resuming the former growth paths, which have been again depicted by the previous speaker. In the Middle East and North African countries, unemployment rates are around 10%, but youth unemployment is close to 30%. With a 2.7% annual workforce growth, the region has one of the fastest growing workforce in the world. Labor market inefficiencies, particularly skill mismatches, remain as a key problem in addressing the unemployment problem in the region. The heavy public sector share in the labor market, for instance, in Egypt, the public sector accounts for 70% of non-agricultural employment, hinders economic dynamism in the region. Inequitable and non-inclusive growth and weak social policies result in high unemployment and poverty rates in most countries of the Middle East and North Africa region. With the exception of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates, the elasticity of employment to GDP growth in the region on average is around 0.5. In 2010, 5% of the Middle East and North Africa population were also below the lowest $1.25 a day poverty line and suffer from many forms of deprivation, including malnutrition. As many as 17% of Egyptians, 15% of Yemenis, and 10% of Moroccans had consumption levels which are only 50 cents above the $2 a day poverty line. Now, building on the demands of the Arab Spring on employment and better incomes and to be included in the inclusive growth, all on these demands, the World Bank has consulted a large scale of stakeholders across civil society and has developed a new policy framework for its dialogue with the governments of the Middle East and North Africa. According to this new policy framework developed by the World Bank, the 4 points are essentially important. First, strengthening governance through transparency and accountability measures. Second, increasing social and economic inclusion of disadvantaged groups. Third, creating jobs, including for youth and women, by providing an enabling environment for opportunity, competition, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And fourth, accelerating sustainable growth through managing stresses on natural resources. Now, this framework appears to be a well-designed broad strategy for economic and social development of the countries which are at the center of the Arab Spring. But we should keep in mind that these 4 pillars, in some forms or other, were already included in the pre-Arab Spring government programs, and that their adoption now by new governments will not also guarantee that demands of the Arab Spring will effectively be attended, as they were not done in the previous government's programs. Meeting these demands will require successful implementation of the 6 points above through increased competitiveness and diversification of the economies. Secondly, through improved business and investment environment. And thirdly, through not only strengthening but also democratization of governance. But if you look at these areas, these 3 areas, in the present Arab economies, we will see quite big hurdles, great hurdles, in front of the realization of demands of the Arab Spring. The World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index shows that the Gulf economies continue to be up in the index rankings among the first 40 countries out of 144 countries in the 2012-13 index. In other words, the Gulf countries are doing well, almost as well as many European and other developed countries. But North African and Levantine countries, Jordan and Lebanon, their competitiveness rankings have stagnated or deteriorated in recent years and is lagging well behind the Gulf countries in the 2012-13 index. Jordan and Lebanon's rankings were close to the midpoint of the index, in other words, around 70-72. While Egypt, Algeria, and Libya, their rankings stood around the rank 110 out of 144. Well, these economies will have to improve their competitiveness both at international and domestic markets to accelerate their growth rates. To make the growth more inclusive and equitable, also diversification of production and exports will have to be achieved. Improvement of both competitiveness and diversification, on the other hand, can be facilitated by the presence of a business environment conducive to entrepreneurship, innovation, and investing by domestic and foreign investors. On the other hand, when we look at the present status of the business environment in the Arab countries affected by the Arab Spring revolts, with the help of the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business 2013 index, we see that out of 185 countries included in this index, most Gulf countries have rankings among the first 50 countries. On the other hand, all countries at the center of the Arab Spring have rankings between 1970 and 118th, except for Tunisia, which ranks well, 50th, and Algeria, which is worst, 152nd. What improvements are required to render business environment in North African and Levantine countries more conducive to private sector development are reflected in an executive opinion survey undertaken in 2013. The survey was focusing on 2012 conditions by the World Economic Forum, identifies 10 or 12 major factors as problematic for doing ease of doing business. I have taken out the most important 6 factors out of this total 12 factors. They are in the decreasing importance are as follows. Inefficient government bureaucracy. This is the first main problematic factor seen as an obstacle to doing business with ease. The second one, access to financing. The third one is policy instability. Not the political instability, but economic policy instability. Fourth, corruption. Fifth, inadequately educated workforce. And sixth, government instability coups. So if we take the final one, political and policy instability together is an important finishing? Johnson? It immediately leaps to the eye that business development in North Africa and the Levant would benefit from a stronger institutional setup, in particular from less bureaucracy and less corruption, more political and policy stability, and better skills match in the labor market. I skip some paragraphs and then come to the final parts of my talk, to design and effectively implement right policies for increasing competitiveness and diversification of their economies, and for building a favorable business environment conducive to greater private sector dynamism, new governments of the countries affected by the Arab Spring need to reform and strengthen the related state structures and institutions. There is a need to move away from past systems of patronage, nepotism, rent-seeking, and corruption towards a regulatory system that fosters fair competition and equal access to opportunities with greater transparency, accountability, participatory decision-making. Now here, I want to touch 2 points which have been referred to in the earlier statements, but I think I want to emphasize further these 2 points. The role of corruption. The corruption is ranked as the 4th among the most problematic factors to prevent ease of doing business. But I think it must be a quite understatement, because the survey identifies those factors by asking questions to the businessmen. What do they think about the most problematic factors? By most businessmen, corruption is not considered probably a problematic factor. It is considered most probably as a facilitating factor, making price and quality competition redundant. So it is very harmful for resource allocation to promote the most productive production in the best areas to be used, most productive areas to be used, is defeated by the influence of corruption, as I said, because it eliminates the need to compete on price and quality basis. And the second point which I want to touch with as my last point is the role of democracy. All of these business environment conditions, favorable business environment conditions, would be very much dependent on the prevailing of democracy, as long as we believe, as long as we define the democracy as it is usually understood in the Western countries. We have heard quite many references to democracy, but no one defined what no one mentioned what is the definition of democracy, because there is no need to define it, because there is one type of democracy. All the conditions are known to democracy. But then we should ask if democracy, in the way it is understood in the Western world, can be established with sectarian and tribal basis political parties. Now, the democratic conditions for a favorable business environment to be established, to make the private sector dynamic, entrepreneurship, and investing enough for competitiveness and diversification of the economy, can it be achieved, that kind of democracy, with sectarian and tribal basis political parties? I believe this is not likely, and I believe one of the main problems in the North Africa and Middle East countries after this Arab Spring is still trying to reach democracy with parties based on sectarian and tribal bases or linkages. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Durdar, that you looked to the region from another angle. And now I would like to proceed to the session with Dr. Peter Havlik, who is attached to Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And he's going to look at MENA region and make some comparisons, giving advantages, disadvantages, making comparison with some European countries, including CIS region. Please, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to this extremely interesting conference. Second, I would like to apologize for speaking in blue jeans, but my luggage is still somewhere between Vienna and Baku. I don't know exactly where. So this is the apology. And the second or third thing which I want to mention is that being one of the last speakers, it is of course very difficult to say something new, what you didn't hear yet. Nevertheless, I will still try, hopefully, to tell you something new, and I will focus on kind of policy lessons and perhaps policy recommendations. This is the list of the countries which I cover in my research and in my presentation. Why this comparison of Middle East and North Africa or Arab Spring countries with Central and Southeast European countries? Well, one of the reasons is that after the outbreak of the Arab Spring, there were many expectations that these are revolutions which are very similar to those revolutions which happened in Central and Eastern Europe at the end of 1980s and beginning of the 90s. I would argue rather that this comparison is not really proper, but nevertheless there are still some lessons which can be learned from the experience of Central and East European countries. Well, I will not go into all points of my paper. I will try to focus instead on something which perhaps wasn't mentioned so far. So first of all, let's start with the reform agenda, which may perhaps still expect the Arab Spring countries, and this reform agenda can be perhaps similar to some of the reforms which Central and East European countries have undertaken in the last 2 decades. So first of all, what was on the priority list? Liberalization of prices, foreign trade, exchange rate, capital account transactions. The second broad area was privatization of both small and large enterprises. Various methods have been used for these privatizations. It has been mentioned by some of the previous speakers that in Arab Spring countries the private sector is either rather small or in some countries really de facto non-existent. That means that the creation of the vulnerable or let's say sustainable private sector is one of the key priorities. These reform areas, which I mentioned very briefly, were summarized under the slogan, so-called Washington Consensus. One of the ideas was that these economic reforms have to be introduced rather fast, partly also because of political reasons, because there was a need to overcome the possible resistance from the old elites. So this is another very complicated part of the story. What is very important and what I would like to point out, and which was not perhaps mentioned so far so strongly, is that all these reforms require very strong and sustainable institutional changes, institutional reforms. Of course, these are very difficult and have been very often delayed. or perhaps even neglected, especially at the beginning of transition. But without these institutional reforms, it's really very difficult to introduce sustainable economic reforms. What was also very important was a so-called external anchor of the reform. In Central and Eastern Europe, it was the prospect of, let's say, going back to Europe, accession to the European Union. So there was a kind of institutional and political model. This is something which is lacking in Arab countries, and it is very important. Regional integration was mentioned also as a very important part of the development agenda for the Arab Spring countries, and indeed the experience of Central and Eastern Europe only confirms this. Well, excuse me, another point which should be mentioned, that it was shown by my colleague from the IMF just a couple of minutes ago, is this long-term view. And if you compare the economic performance of the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, with the performance of new member states of the European Union and Southeast Europe and CIS countries, this is this group of Central and East European countries, you see that after the transition, after the revolution started in Central and Eastern Europe, there was a huge and deep so-called transitional recession, which resulted from many factors, but one of very important ones was the implementation of these reforms. Liberalization of prices, privatization, disintegration of the existing trading links, and so on. And if you compare the performance of the MENA region, you see that there has been a more or less stable growth, despite some deceleration at the beginning of this, let's say, decade, partly because of the result of the global crisis, but there has not been anything like that comparable to the transformational recession which we experienced in Central and Eastern Europe. And now the big question is, should we expect a similar recession as a result of reforms if these are going to be implemented in the Arab Spring countries? I would not exclude this. This is definitely a very serious issue, and again, one has to expect political bottlenecks, social unrest. Again, it has been mentioned by some of the speakers previously that this is something what has to be feared in Arab Spring countries. I am not going to show you all results of the analysis, perhaps just a selection of some of indicators and illustration of the arguments. It has been mentioned by some of the previous speakers, this importance of doing business, investment climate, and so on. And indeed, the analysis clearly shows that the MENA countries are performing much, much poorer than the average of Central and East European countries in terms of these investment climate indicators. What is important to say is that in the last couple of years, the data here are for 2011. A couple of days ago, new data were published for 2013, 2014, and this data show that all or the majority of MENA countries decline in their investment ratings. That means that the situation has deteriorated. And this is, of course, something which is not good for doing business and investment and economic development in general. I am not going into details here. Perhaps I will go immediately to some challenges, lessons and conclusions. I will perhaps say something only about this bottom part of the problems and challenges. What I would like to stress again is the importance of this regional integration in the MENA region, which is extremely important. Again, it has been already mentioned, but it has to be reiterated, because although the experience from other countries clearly show that this is extremely important. MENA region does not have any realistic perspective of membership with the European Union, which means that this external reform anchor is missing. And these countries therefore have to look for some other alternative reform anchors, and this is again a very challenging issue. One of the possibilities which has been perhaps also suggested in the literature is that there may be something like pan-Islamic integration, but this is probably something which is at least in the long run. I will skip a couple of other suggestions and recommendations and move immediately to the end of my presentation. What is the main challenge and what definitely has to be done in the region? First of all countries in the Arab world and Arab Spring countries have to improve the governance, they have to improve transparency and accountability. This is relating to this issue of corruption, which was mentioned before by Mr. Ambassador from the United States. What is again also needed is the increasing social and economic inclusion, modernization, support of the private sector, fostering regional and global integration. And since there is no realistic reform anchor or accession to the European Union, one has to look for alternative reform anchors. Again, the majority of these points have been already mentioned by previous speakers, but still I think that it is very useful and interesting that more or less independently we have find very similar or almost identical conclusions. And the final point is that, and again this is what the experience of Central and East European countries are showing, is that very likely there will be setbacks. So don't be surprised if these setbacks occur both in terms of economy, like these transitional recessions, or political setbacks, which we unfortunately are witnessing now in Syria or in Libya and possibly in other countries of the region as well. So thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Dr. Havlik, for your points and comparison made between the regions. And as you touched economic development matters, I would like to stick on human development, which is in fact basics, fundamentals of economic development. And it's better if we continue with corporate social responsibility, which is directly linked with human beings with us. And I would like to continue with Dr. Riham Rizk, who is the last presenter in our session. Again, lady, but it doesn't mean that we have forgot our ladies, because we began our first panel with a lady, and we are going to end our conference for today with, again, next lady. Please, Doctor.
You preempted any sort of obnoxious comment from me on the subject already. Well done. Good evening. I am Riham Rizk, and I won't even pretend I'm going to teach you anything new or say anything new. So consider me your wrap-up for the day to just kind of go over some of a lot of the issues that were raised. perhaps with a slightly different spin. I am from Durham University, which is the lovely place you see in the photo, for those who do not know. 40 years ago, a leading academic professor, Dao Vota, who was, besides being a prominent academic in the field, was also the former dean of the Haas Business School at UC Berkeley, had this fantastic criticism of corporate social responsibility, or CSR. The term is a brilliant one. It means something, but not always the same thing to everybody. To some, it conveys the idea of legal responsibility or liability. To others, it means socially responsible behavior in an ethical sense. To still others, the meaning transmitted is that of responsible for in causal mode. Many simply equate it with a charitable contribution. Despite 40 years of intensive academic as well as practitioner debate and research in the area, this criticism is unfortunately still true. Being a glass half full kind of girl, I see the biggest criticism of CSR, also the biggest opportunity for CSR. In the 40 years since that criticism, I would perhaps add a few more categories of individuals and how they perceive or conceive CSR or what they conceive it to be. There are some who view it as being wrong, extremely wrong in some instances. Wrong first perhaps from the perspective of the firm, in that it's a misappropriation of shareholder funds. Wrong from the perspective of society, in that it gives large multinationals a smokescreen behind which to hide unsustainable and discredited business models, also referred to as greenwash in a lot of the literature and the popular press. I put them in the middle because I tend to view them as those in the middle of the road, sort of entrepreneurial / opportunistic, whether they're first movers in the area or a bit of follow the leader and mimicking best practices. They see it as a business opportunities, or they see the business opportunities arising from catering to this arguably niche market of ethical investors and or consumers. Right, which maybe when I look at it now, maybe those are the ones on the left, but I mean right as in correct as opposed to right and left. There's a large growing body of literature and debate around the emancipatory power of CSR and how it can liberate us from the ills and woes of capitalism. There is still a further group that see genuine opportunities to help leverage millions out of poverty. As such, CSR tends to be viewed as a complex, often contested, and even a new term that has come up in the literature as a tortured concept. So how do you define a tortured concept? It is perhaps unsurprising that there are as many definitions of CSR as there are disagreements about the actual role of organizations or corporations in society. Just a few examples. One from the UK government off of the dedicated CSR platform on voluntary actions that business can take over and above compliance with minimum legal requirements to address both its own competitive interests and the interests of wider society. I particularly like the definition since China was brought up in the previous session. I'm glad I included this definition. Chinese Ministry of Commerce views CSR as concrete actions taken by Chinese companies to implement the political aspiration of the new Communist Party collective leadership. Putting people first to create a harmonious society. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development is a civil society organization, arguably unlike others, given that it is not a grassroots organization. It was actually created by businesses, which might explain the use of the word continuing commitment back in 1999. Whether or not there was any prior commitment is debatable, but their definition is a continuing commitment by business to behave ethically and contribute to economic development while improving the quality of life of the workforce, their families, local community, and society at large. Since the C in CSR is corporate, it's only appropriate that I give you a couple of corporate definitions, or actually just the one corporate definition apparently, from the GAP. Being socially responsible means striving to incorporate our values and ethics into everything we do, from how we run our businesses, to how we treat our employees, to how we impact upon the communities where we live and work. Christian Aid is a non-governmental organization, and their view is an entirely voluntary corporate-led initiative to promote self-regulation as a substitute for regulation at either national or international level. Variations of a theme, variations of the same theme, perhaps unsurprising, the positions taken by the different organizations that I've just talked to you about. Unsurprising given the stakeholder groups that they actually represent. Traditionally, businesses look to academia for more concrete, coherent frameworks. As a career academic, I can tell you, in the CSR area, academics are equally guilty of wishy-washy definitions that don't tend to actually mean anything. One that I particularly like, and that I think is most appropriate for this conference, is the Matten and Moon 2004 definition. CSR is a cluster concept which overlaps with other concepts such as business ethics, corporate philanthropy, corporate citizenship, sustainability, and environmental responsibility. It is a dynamic and contestable concept that is embedded in each social, political, economic, and institutional context. This is the definition, the working definition, that I'll use for the next 45 minutes with you. Just making sure you're still awake. The core characteristics, that regardless of how you conceptualize or define CSR, has about six core characteristics. It is voluntary. I think that was noted mostly in the UK government definition of what CSR is. And this is the actual criteria that is seen by critics of CSR as its major flaw. Does volunteerism actually work? The Christian Aid definition focused in on, and what most critics of CSR focus in on, that it perhaps needs to be better regulated, more stringent, and it's the regulated legal aspects of CSR that should get the most attention. CSR is about internalizing or managing externalities. Externalities being the positive or negative effects of economic or consequences of economic behavior that are borne by others, not reflected in the market price of goods or services. All the definitions will also include a stakeholder orientation versus a shareholder orientation. So the classic theory of the firm and the business of business is business argument, very much a move away from that. But that's not to say that it should come at the expense of economic priorities or responsibilities. So all definitions of CSR will focus in on this alignment of social and economic responsibilities. A term I very much like is enlightened self-interest. Do well by doing good. Also termed the business case for CSR, that you can actually make a pretty good, decent living by doing the right thing as an organization. CSR is obviously about very specific practices and policies and behaviors, but it's also about values, and it's the value dimension of CSR that creates the most contempt and potentially the most contentious part of the definitions, because it's the why. If it's about what organizations do to appear socially responsible or to be socially responsible, not as contentious as why they do it. All definitions of CSR also will focus in on that it is very much beyond philanthropy. This is not about largesse of corporations throwing a few crumbs to the communities in which they work. It is about, or it's very much predicated on the assumption that CSR needs to be mainstreamed rather than simply a discretionary activity or activities, meaning or implying that it needs to be built into processes, all major business functions, from marketing to finance to production to logistics and everything else I've forgotten to mention, rather than just being bolted on as an extra activity. The key themes in CSR will all start, I think the last presenter touched on issues of transparency, accountability, and more broadly, notions of governance, corporate governance very specifically. For key areas beyond transparency, the specific areas of CSR tend to look at marketplace, anything having to do with product safety, access, the costs, etc. of products, workplace related, anything employee related, from equal opportunities, or arguably based on some of the presentations about the high levels of unemployment in the MENA region, about employment or opportunities of any sort, equal or otherwise, health and safety of employees, etc. The community, issues of infrastructure, education, healthcare, etc., and the natural or ecological environment. So where are we today, 40 years on from Vota's critique and 21 years on from the Earth Summit in Rio, the original Earth Summit? CSR is no longer just about the usual suspects, being those in the extractive industries, the dirty industries, mining, oil and gas, tobacco, those nasty evil creatures. Today, virtually no industry sector, market, business type that has not experienced growing demands to legitimate its practices to society at large or to very specific segments of society. Starting from governments, he's no longer in the room, Dr. Samah talked about legitimacy of governments, of Morsi's government and his removal, to government organizations, to NGOs, to civil society organizations. It is not just the C is a bit of a misnomer. Corporate does not imply big, large, ugly corporation. It applies equally to SMEs, arguably, perhaps even more so. Even traditionally clean industries, a term I use in the loosest sense with regards to banking, but that is one of the clean industries traditionally, has very much a CSR agenda, or CSR is very much on the banking sector's agenda, healthcare, education, pharmaceuticals, etc. It is absolutely no longer simply academic rhetoric. CSR is everywhere you go. It's in the annual reports and other communications to shareholders. It's in dedicated websites by organizations, by governments, by institutions of various sorts. It's in our boardrooms the world over. It's in election campaigns. It's probably most notably in news and media. It's even in the cinema, with films such as, if they have any meaning to you, Blood Diamonds, which was about conflict diamonds out of Africa, Super Size Me, which was about, do we know? No? About the fast food industry and what it's doing and creation or contributing to obesity issues the world over. Because I like consistency, I use the term, again, no longer about Western best practices, but I have spent the last 10 years of my life arguing that it was never a Western best practice to begin with. Grameen Bank, for example, in Bangladesh, over 35 years of responsible microfinance activity. Tata in India, the Tata Group, well over 100 years of responsible business activity. I had a high school teacher who actually told me many years ago that you can tell a good idea by the stages it goes through. All good ideas go through the same stages. First, you trash the idea, then you trash the inventor, and then a few more stages. The very final stage is people try to steal it. So that's how you can tell a really good idea, is if people try to steal it. So I have, again, a bit more shameless plugging for myself and my research. I have spent the last 6 or 7 years arguing that it's actually ours being Islamic ethics. For over 1400 years, all of these notions about responsible business practice and attention to the environment all exist in the Quran well over 1400 years ago. So what does this have to do with us and why we're here and what we're talking about? Surely this can't possibly be a solution for post-revolutionary Arab economies. I would argue that it is. That a lot of the specific features and characteristics identified by previous speakers as being challenges are actually the conditions that make those countries ripe for greater, considerable scope for the exercise of CSR. Issues such as the low standards for working conditions, low environmental protection, high corruption, or various degrees of corruption, oppressive regimes, non-existent regimes, power vacuums, whatever term, low regard for human rights, poor provision of healthcare and education, low levels of per capita and foreign direct investment. That is precisely the breeding ground that should encourage businesses to step up and fill that void. Label it anything you like, whether dissatisfaction or awareness or an acceptance of the notion and its place in Arab economies. There is very much that already happening prior to the revolutions, arguably stalled a bit in the last couple of years, but it's out there. Even in those countries, even in those places. But in order for it to have meaning, CSR, for it to be real or relevant, must be contextual. Context is very important. It must be important to the individuals. It must be a national issue. It must. So there is genuinely a growing degree of awareness of these issues in the MENA region. Not just by the general population, but also an acceptance of it in the capital market authorities, in the listing requirements of stock exchanges, in the requirements, the governance requirements of stock exchanges, all of that linked, in the growth in NGOs and civil society organizations in their prominence. So, having said that it needs to be national issues for it to have meaning, I think more qualified individuals than I have already identified what those issues are. There are a few that I picked out, which I think relate very much to some of the speakers earlier today. Post-oil economies, what are these countries going to do after the oil runs out? And should that not in itself naturally lend itself to investments in greener technologies or smart technologies, smart energy? The young populations, the statistics that were quoted earlier of upwards of 50% in some countries, upwards of 60%, closer to 70% of the population is under the age of 30. You'll see from the top of my slides, I write challenges and opportunities because I see the same variables as being, or seeing that two sides of the same coin. For every one of these points, it is both a challenge and an opportunity for these companies, for these governments, for these economies. The economic empowerment of women, the attraction, development, and retention of female talent in the region. Without stepping on too many toes with tomorrow's speakers, this might be my one chance to actually say something new today. The issue of the rise of Islamic, or the Islamic revival. I am not a political scientist, and therefore I'm not going to call it political or otherwise, but just this renewal of the revival of. We have already a tradition and a culture thousands of years old, pre-Islam and post-Islamic civilizations in the region, of charity, giving, openness, caring and sharing, all those wonderful, beautiful notions. They seem to unfortunately only manifest themselves 1 month out of the year, during Ramadan. So I'm kind of paraphrasing the strapline from a UK charity, which is, the actual strapline is, a puppy is for life, not just for Christmas. So I'm paraphrasing that, and that's my attempt at academic integrity of referencing it, that the earth is not just for Ramadan, it is actually for life. The Holy Quran has slightly over 6,000 verses. Of those 6,000 verses, over 800 of them are explicit references to nature, the natural environment, protection of waterways, treatment of animals. I know, it was a surprise to me too. It was, and I've been Muslim all my life. I bring you full circle. I started with Vota, I end with Vota. If the leaders of business continue to conceive of social responsibility as a mere euphemism for charity, a surrogate for the corporate image, a concern only for the public relations department, or simply a passing fad, they will fail to meet what may be one of mankind's greatest challenges. Professor Vota has unfortunately died in 2004 at the ripe young age of 83, so I'm unable to ask him if this is what he meant, but in the words of the straplines of the Arab Spring, Aish, Hurriya, Adala Ijtimaiya, Karama Insaniya. Bread, freedom, social justice, and human dignity are perhaps mankind's greatest challenges, not just for the MENA region, but for all of humanity. Complaints can be directed at Mahir. Questions and comments. Thank you all for your attention, and that's all for it.
Many thanks, Dr. Rizk, for touching this important topic, corporate social responsibility, which is in fact, I would say, lacking in the Eastern world. I don't want to divide our world to two parts, Eastern and Western, but I would like to end our session with the name of, or with the words of one Muslim intellectual, or let's say intellectual, who said about these things, saying, Ra'aytul Islam bila Muslimin, going to one part of the world. And obviously we don't have we don't have time for questions and comments, but if you have any urgent questions from audience, we can allow for one or maximum two questions. If there is no more questions, we can continue during the dinner. Thank you very much, and I would like to end here. Many thanks for our presenters.